Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Glucksman Ireland House here at New York University. I'm delighted on a fall day to have some of you here with us, and as I mentioned, we are live streaming and capturing the audio of this event, so welcome all, especially if it's your first time here at Glucksman Ireland House. This is the Centre for Irish and Irish American Studies here at New York University. We're actually in the midst of celebrating our 25th anniversary. Loretta Brennan Glucksman and her late husband Lou Glucksman had a brainwave in 1991 that NYU should have a Centre for Irish and Irish American Studies, and in 1993 our doors opened. We have a fairly vibrant public events calendar, so please pick up a hard copy of it, leaving if you have not already. I'm really delighted and honoured to be sharing the stage to some extent here with David Margolick and Bud Mishkin, and want to start off by congratulating David on such a fine contribution to the literature on this theme of, I suppose part of the reason I contacted David about coming and talking about the book was I felt it was nice for us on the 50th anniversary of 1968 as such an important year in American history to reflect on that. And when I had seen David's book coming out, I thought it was a great way for us to meditate on that a little bit through the lens of his great work on Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. David is a long-time contributing editor at Vanity Fair. Prior to that, for 15 years, he was legal affairs reporter at the New York Times, where he covered the trials of O.J. Simpson and Lorena Bobbitt, among others, and wrote the weekly At the Bar column. His work there was nominated 4 times for the Pulitzer Prize. He has been a frequent contributor to the New York Times Book Review and the Wall Street Journal's weekly review section. He is the author of many books, including Dreadful, The Short Life and Gay Times of John Bourne Burns, which I started and had to discipline myself to put down to keep reading this book because it's great, so I highly recommend it. Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, Beyond Glory, Joe Lewis and Max Schmeling, and Word on the Brink, and Strange Fruit, the biography of a song. David thankfully lives in New York City and was very generous in agreeing to come and speak to us today. Bud Mishkin, when Bud offered to participate in this event, I immediately seized the opportunity. Bud is a broadcast journalist, interviewer, live event host, public speaker and panel moderator. He was one of New York One's original anchor reporters in 1992 and spent 25 years at the News Channel. From 1992 to 2017, Bud served as a sports anchor reporter covering a wide variety of New York sports stories and anchoring New York's nightly show Sports on One, The Last Word. In 2003, and the reason in particular I was familiar with Bud's work was he created a weekly series entitled One on One with Bud Mishkin, profiling influential and intriguing New Yorkers from a wide range of fields. I think the last time Bud was here in the house was actually in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, unless you've been here since, and I didn't know about it. And Bud was profiling, that was part of your profile of Jimmy Breslin, I believe, and you were interviewing Pete Hamill here in the house, both of whom feature in David's book. That's right?
Well, there was I think we did a story that night. I think I'd done Pete and Jimmy previously, but we were doing a story that night about that. It was an amazing night where people came up left and right talking about Jimmy Breslin, one more eloquent than the next. And it was a really great New York night.
And actually to plug while we're on speaking about those two influential and important New Yorkers in Jimmy, who's passed away, of course, unfortunately, and Pete Hamill, we are doing a tribute to Pete Hamill on Monday, December 10th. We're working with Dan Barry from the New York Times on that, so hopefully that will end up being a special night as well. So My claim to fame is I'm the Associate Director here at Glucksman Ireland House, and I direct the Master's Programme. I've been here for 12 years and have worn and continue to wear various different hats here. So what the format of today is that we're going to, Bud and I are going to tag team a little bit in terms of asking David questions. We're very ill prepared in terms of actually preparing formal questions. I've done some research on an event they did already together, and we're just going to, it's going to be a fireside chat. We have Irish tea and everything going on here without the fire, so it's going to be fairly informal and friendly, and just to have the opportunity to hear from David about his research for this book and just the things that have percolated in the course of writing it. I also want to draw attention to the fact that the NYU bookstore is downstairs and will be selling copies of the book afterwards, and I'm sure if you're nice to David, he will sign a copy.
Even if you're not nice.
He will sign them anyway. So we'll hand over now, and maybe, Bud, I'll open it up to you to ask the first question, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thank you for the invitation, for being here. It's a beautiful place, a beautiful part of New York City and NYU. As a journalist, you're supposed to be unbiased, but when it comes to the writing of David Margolick, forget unbiased. He is a great writer, and this book is a must-read, and some of the other books that you mentioned as well from the past, the book about Joe Louis and Max Schmeling and what that fight in 1938 meant as far as the world was concerned, the book about Strange Fruit, the Great Billie Holiday song, these are all must-reads. So, these are two figures about whom more than a little bit has been written, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. What type of pressure for a writer does that create when you are writing about a subject and people who have been written about extensively?
Well, every writer wants to have something original to say, and it was very intimidating in a way for a couple of reasons. One was, as you say, Bud, and I want to thank you for doing this today. I mean, I feel the same way about you, and there are very few people around, actually, whose minds are so eclectic as to take in the varying stuff that I've done and sort of get it all. So I just want to say how much I appreciate you and what you're doing and your participation in this. I'm very flattered. And that's to say nothing of your inviting me, Miriam, and coming here. This is a different kind of group and a different sort of angle, and it's always fun to explore one's work from different vantage points. I want to thank you for that. So it's intimidating to come into something that's been so extensively written about. Even to come up to square one is hard, because there are mammoth books on these guys. The Arthur Schlesinger biography of Robert Kennedy is over 1,000 pages long. I don't know about you, but it takes me a while to read a book that long. I mean, that's a lot of hours, you know.
Let alone months.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they add up to months. So that's the first thing that's intimidating. The second thing is that with the exigencies of the journalism business these days, I got this thing as an assignment, and I was told I had 4 months to do it. So that made it even more daunting, really, in a way. It turns out that there was a third problem, which in some ways took care of some of the earlier ones. It was complicated because it turned out that for everything that had been written about these two guys, there was very little about the relationship between the two of them. And so that meant that I had kind of clear sailing on the one hand, but that there wasn't a lot of secondary stuff that I could look at and sort of rip off if I wanted to. You know, I mean, a lot of people who write books just sort of repackage other books. That wouldn't have been what I wanted to do anyway, but I didn't even have that option if I wanted to. I mean, I had an excuse because time was so short. The idea was that this thing was going to come out in time for the anniversaries of the 2 assassinations. And so we were talking about this in April of 2017, and the thing had to be done. You know, you think with computerization and everything that things get quicker in publishing, but they don't. The lead time is the same, and you had to get it done by the fall of 2017 in order for it to be out by April of 2018. So that was 4 months, for 4 or 5 months. Originally, you can let me know when I'm going on too long here, but there's a whole history to this thing, which I think is kind of interesting. It was to me. I mean, this was originally going to be principally a picture book done by the National Geographic. And I was, as I sort of say in the book, I was hired to do the grouting. You know, the pictures were the tiles, and I was just doing the cementing around them, and that was going to be it. But again, I really wanted to say something more important than that. We all want our books to last, and we want them, if they're not necessarily read at the time they come out, and that's often the case, you want them to be read somewhere down the line. I have a button somewhere that says posthumous success. You know, well, that's okay with me. You know, that's okay with me.
Oh, no time soon.
Yeah, that's all right. No time soon, but that's okay with me. I was talking to a group of my father's old colleagues, doctors, the other night, and I said, "It's a posthumous success. May not be so hot for you, but for me, you know, I don't mind it. I don't mind it."
There's a great old Richard Thompson song called "Now That I Am Dead."
Yeah.
And the whole notion is now Rolling Stone wants to interview him. And
right, that's good. Yeah, that's
Were you
good.
confident throughout the process that, understanding that no one had written about the connection between them, that you really had something here? Or are there moments of doubt of, clearly they're two compelling people, clearly it's a compelling time, is there really that connection there, or am I trying to create a connection?
Well, there was one sobering moment that I recount in the introduction to the book, where I interviewed Robert Kennedy's eldest daughter, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. Some of you will know. She was, I think, the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, ran for Governor or Senator of Maryland, and a very formidable woman. And I interviewed her right at the beginning of my research, and she said, "You don't have a book here. There's no book here." Now that can generate a little bit of hesitation. That was not one of my more confident moments. And why did she say that? She said that because she said these two guys barely knew one another. There's very little correspondence between the two of them. She didn't say this, but it's true that there aren't even any good pictures of the two of them together. I mean, that's quite striking. I mean, there are some group pictures where the two of them appear together. But she said that, you know, the fact that they coexisted for a certain length of time doesn't mean that there's a book here. And she sort of sent me on my way. I suppose that had there been a nadir of my confidence, it would have been that moment. But in fact, to answer your question, Bud, I never really doubted that there was a book. You know, I knew I'd find a book. I knew that I'd create a book. Now, the question, I suppose, is whether or not the book would be hype, in a way, or exaggerated to suit my contractual obligations. But my feeling was that you have the most important civil rights leader of his era and the Attorney General of the United States who determined the course of civil rights in this country. They had to be acutely aware of what one another was doing, and even if they weren't interacting directly all that much, they were very mindful of each other, and that in and of itself was a book. It just meant that it would be a little bit harder to ferret out the details. I also knew, very shortly into the thing, that Robert Kennedy started out in almost a negative position on civil rights, and Robert Kennedy didn't know Martin Luther King, and to the degree that he knew him, he was sort of hostile to him. And Robert Kennedy approved wiretaps of King's phone, and then a few years later, really in a blink of an eye, Robert Kennedy was eulogizing Martin Luther King more memorably than anybody at Martin Luther King's funeral. So how, you know, when you figure all the points at which they do come together, and the dramatic change in those moments from Robert Kennedy as hostile really to civil rights to Robert Kennedy identifying with King, and conversely, Martin Luther King cursing Robert Kennedy's appointment as Attorney General, thinking that Robert Kennedy was a malign and negative force and he tells Harry Belafonte, it's recounted in the book, you know, find me this guy's moral center. We got to deal with this guy. We have to live with this guy. You know, find me the good side of him. Okay, and moving from that to the point where only 8 years later, on the eve of his assassination, he's prepared to endorse Robert Kennedy for president. So there's a dramatic evolution in both of their thinking about one another. And I knew that simply that thread, just piecing, just connecting the dots in that line was a book. So I was never really fearful of it.
And I think, David, that's really one of the major contributions of this book in terms of contextualizing that the evolving nature of the relationship and what's going on with them, to see it culminating in the way that it did. One of the things that I wanted to ask you a little bit about from a historian's point of view in terms of sources, David, I think it was actually maybe in an earlier event you did with Bud, you talked about the dominance, say for example, of the New York Times as a source, and how, you know, sometimes we don't actually think consciously enough, I think, of how much of a prisoner we are to sources in terms of what's dominating the narrative at any point in time. Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of the research for
well, that's, you know, it's an interesting point, Miriam, to me, because I spent 15 years at the New York Times, and I'm very loyal to it, and I love it, and I think it's more indispensable than ever. But that said, the Times has a stranglehold on American history in a way, at least among unimaginative or lazy historians, because the Times is readily available, the Times is indexed, the Times is usually clipped, the Times morgue is better than any other existing newspaper morgue in the country. The Times is on ProQuest, the Times is easily searched, and because of the Times' preeminence, people think that it's the only source or the best source for any kind of historical research. And I know that's not true. And not only that, but because it's the most deeply mined source for somebody, again, as I say, who was trying to be original, I knew that any originality I brought to this thing would not be from finding things in the Times that no one had seen, because it had been pretty, I mean, I did find things in the Times that no one had seen, often, you know, little tiny things. I should be able to think of something, but little things about King or Kennedy, in what they call in the business shirt tails, little tiny stories at the bottom of longer stories that you wouldn't necessarily see. So there were original things even there, but I mean, what I and some of the more senior people in this audience will remember, first of all, the Herald Tribune was a very important paper, okay? The Herald Tribune of blessed memory, often better written than the Times. It was the writer's paper. I mean, people actually, when I was doing the boxing book, I came across a sports writer who left the Times to go to the Tribune because the Tribune let you spread your wings.
Right.
And you know, you're looking for sort of literate and colorful people to read, and you didn't find them in the Times. The Times was very dull. The Times is much more lively now, but it was dull back then. So the Tribune was out there. More important than the Tribune was the Post. I mean, you were talking before, Bud, about Jimmy Breslin. Jimmy Breslin was writing for the Post. Pete Hamill was writing for the Post. Murray Kempton was writing for the Post. Jimmy Wexler was writing for the Post. These were all people who covered civil rights and Bobby Kennedy closely.
To be clear, the New York Post.
The New York Post, yes.
And a much different New York Post.
The Dorothy Schiff New York Post, the pre-Murdoch Post. That's right. Which was absolutely a crucial source and is not scanned, so it's very hard to search. The morgue has been, the archive of clippings has been sort of disassembled. My friend at the Post, at the New York Post, Eric Fettman, who's sort of the archivist of these kinds of things, got me into them to look at the old clippings there, but it's very hard to piece them together because there's no electronic way to do it, but it's very important to read all of these people. Then there's the Washington Post, Then there are the black newspapers. You know, the black papers were still important back then. The black weeklies like the Amsterdam News, Ebony Magazine. These were all very important. I should, just to go back to the Post, I meant to note that we're talking about Robert Kennedy here, but the New York Post was the first paper in New York to have a full-time black reporter. All right, so the New York Post was in Montgomery covering the bus boycott in the 50s, 1954, 55. They had somebody down there interviewing Martin Luther King as the young preacher of the church down there, long before the New York Times was covering it. So these are all essential sources and ways of breaking out of the kind of stranglehold that my alma mater has over coverage of all of these things.
I love the point about finding something that you've been looking for, or finding something that, again, is perhaps not part of what the stories that most of us know. There's a great part in the book. Obviously, we know that death hangs in the air throughout the entire book because we know what's going to happen at the end. And there's a beautiful piece of writing here, which I just wanted to say on page 52, in which you write, later on, and especially after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it became commonplace to say that both King and Bobby Kennedy knew they were doomed. Kennedy was no stranger to premature death. Even before his brother's murder, by age 18, he'd lost an older brother and a sister, but only for a few years did death stalk him. It loomed over Kennedy far longer, it loomed over King far longer, so long that he had a chance to devise and polish what he said about it. Quote, "So I'm not afraid of anybody this morning," he said. "If I had to die tomorrow morning, I would die happy because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land," end quote. It sounds like April 1968 in Memphis. In fact, it was January 1957 in Montgomery.
Yeah, the giveaway is there when he says this morning.
Right.
Because it wasn't in that famous last speech that he gave at the temple that night.
And yet, when I read that, I swear I read that like 3 or 4 times. That is one of those moments in a book that, wow, that is a great nugget. That is a great piece. Can you talk a little bit more about the writer as detective when you know that maybe you know that there are things that are out there, a picture or a story, and can I get it? Can I verify it?
Well, and also, I mean, can you find things that are sort of counterintuitive, or change the story, or modify the story, or shake up the complacency of your readers or settled views of history? I mean, part of the story is that Martin Luther King had this prophetic moment the night before he was shot. I've seen, I may not get there with you. You know, and that everything had sort of crystallized for him that night. And, and as that passage points out, he'd been saying these things. I mean, for better or for worse, he'd been saying these things for a very long time. I mean, I have to say that one of the pleasures that I took from doing this book was to shake things up. And if there was ever anything in there that sort of challenged settled views of these guys, I was happy to put it in there, even if it was disconcerting. I mean, part of my job in doing this book, I thought, was to disconcert, So part of that, I mean, with respect to Robert Kennedy, was to depict how right-wing he was before he became a moderate on civil rights. There's a whole section in here, it's sort of apropos speaking here today, where Robert Kennedy is asked by Anthony Lewis of the New York Times when he gives an oral history shortly after. The Kennedys are very good about recording history. They're not always good about sharing history that they record. I mean, for instance, you still can't see Jacqueline Kennedy's oral history at the Kennedy Library. If you're Caroline Kennedy, you can see it and make a book out of it, but the rest of us can't see it. And all of Bobby Kennedy's oral history it's 8 or 9 volumes that he gave, I think in late 1964. Most of it is available, but there are still lots and lots of redacted sections of it. that you can petition to see, but your petitions are almost uniformly denied. I don't think they opened up anything. These things were closed in the 60s and they've never been opened. All right, so they're very selective about parceling these things out. But anyway, sometimes there are revealing things in there that even the people who are the censors don't see. You know, and that if you read them closely, you find these things. One of them was when Anthony Lewis of the Times, again, sort of the stranglehold of the Times, Anthony Lewis and Robert Kennedy were very close. I mean, almost alarmingly close by the standards of contemporary journalism. And, you know, you see, you know, when Anthony Lewis writing stories about Robert Kennedy saying, well, sources close to the Attorney General say such and so. And you know the two of them were just sitting and talking. And Robert Kennedy said, don't quote me on that. And so Anthony Lewis didn't quote him on it. But anyway, Anthony Lewis is interviewing Kennedy for the oral history. And he says, when did you first become aware of the problem of civil rights? You know, thinking that he's going to get, you know, the Kennedys with their famous dinner table conversations about politics and everything. Surely the issue of Negroes and the Negro problem would have come up with old man Kennedy quizzing his kids around the table. And Bobby Kennedy says very proudly, we never talked about it. It just never came up. And he said, you know, he says in so many words, we were colorblind in our house. We didn't see the world this way. You know, some white people, it was the Depression, some white people had problems, some black people had problems, everybody had problems. We didn't see things. He was trying to frustrate Anthony Lewis's assumption about him that he was a liberal guy, and Robert Kennedy was very insistent that he was not liberal, and he didn't believe in special breaks for anyone. And I don't remember how I got off on that tangent.
But can I ask you something related, a
yeah.
question on that a little bit, David? So do you think, in retrospect, because I, you know, fundamentally, my reading of this book, and why I think, genuinely, I feel like it's important for students of American history to read, you're plotting out the evolution of a black man's experience in America and a white man's experience in America, and how they evolve over time, right? So one of the things I was thinking about it in that context was, do you think that Robert Kennedy, were they so locked up in this idea of them as Irish Catholics and trying to, you know, differ or blend in terms of acceptance, that in any way framed how they saw race? If you know what I mean, that, or I'm not putting that question very clearly. How did his sense of Irishness or his sense of being a Catholic feed into how he saw race, do you think, on balance?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that, at least initially, and maybe even going forward, Robert Kennedy thought of himself as sort of an embattled Irish American who didn't feel a natural affinity for large questions concerning the civil rights of other people. And I think that the Kennedys were sort of tribal, and when you follow Robert Kennedy, particularly in the 1950s, race is almost non-existent. He doesn't talk about it. I think his only interest was getting his brother elected president. And it just never comes up. In a way, it comes up in an interesting sort of microcosmic way that I describe in the book and that I'm happy to talk about here. And he complicates, I think it never came up, and I think that because of his own peculiar psychological makeup, he wanted to resist people's stereotypes about him and depict himself as a tough guy and not a softy and not a sentimentalist. And so Robert Kennedy puts out a lot of disinformation about himself that makes it harder even to write about him, because Robert Kennedy was very determined he wasn't going to satisfy Anthony Lewis by saying, yes, I just had this shocking realization of the great injustice inflicted upon black people. He was going to say, everybody had it rough and we didn't believe in giving favors to anybody. And that was very much his orientation. This was why Martin Luther King was so upset when Bobby Kennedy was appointed Attorney General. Again, this is not part of, King is frozen in 1963 in this country. He's frozen at the moment that he gives the I Have a Dream speech, and he's, sort of acceptable to everyone now in retrospect. And we don't deal with King, the late Martin Luther King, who was a radical figure and a divisive figure and really challenging the American economic system, challenging the war in Vietnam. I mean, why was it that there were no pictures of the Kennedys with Martin Luther King? It was because Martin Luther King was radioactive to them, and they didn't want to be seen with him, okay? Which makes the ending, the place where these two guys ended that much more striking. And Robert Kennedy is sort of frozen now in 1968 in Indianapolis when he's giving this speech about brotherhood on the night that Martin Luther King is killed. But why was it that Martin Luther King was so upset when Robert Kennedy, the president's kid brother, was named Attorney General? Robert Kennedy had worked for Joe McCarthy. Now, we all know that he works, and this is something that I learned in doing the book. I mean, I guess I should have been able to figure it out, but it's something that I hadn't thought through, and I had to learn this. I'll speak for myself. I, as a white liberal guy, have my own issues with Joe McCarthy, and he was a villain in my home. All right, for all the usual civil libertarian concerns. But in black America, there was an additional dimension to the antipathy to Joe McCarthy, which was that many black leaders had been leftists or even communists. Like Du Bois was a communist late in his life. Harry Belafonte was a lefty. A lot of the Daily Worker called for the integration of baseball long before any other white paper did. All right, so I mean, communism and radicalism were not the malign forces in the black world that they were in the white world, particularly among the black leadership. So in aligning himself with Joe McCarthy, Robert Kennedy was sort of, McCarthyism was code for racism among the black leadership. All right, so that was another reason to be skeptical of Robert Kennedy. And John Kennedy in 1956, when John Kennedy was running for vice president, he was running against Kefauver, who was considered a Southern progressive. John Kennedy was the favorite of Southern racists. So Robert Kennedy goes to Little Rock in 1956, and he says, "We Kennedys sing Dixie around our breakfast table every morning." So this was the tradition that Robert Kennedy grew out of and came into, and this is what black America knew about Robert Kennedy when he was named Attorney General, which is why Martin Luther King was so horrified by it and said to Harry Belafonte and the other people in his inner circle, find me something good about this guy because we have to work with him.
And yet this is the same guy who late in the book, there's a great Bobby Kennedy quote about black radicals that after what they've been through, we need to listen to them. Paraphrasing.
Yeah.
What was the scene for that?
Well, the interesting thing, I mean, Robert Kennedy is such an interesting figure because he's unpredictable in a lot of ways. He was rebellious, and I think Robert Kennedy, in some ways, Martin Luther King seemed dull to Robert Kennedy. He was sort of a stuffy religious guy. Of course, that was the only side of King that King would show Kennedy. I mean, the sort of ribald King, the sort of jokester, the very funny guy that his colleagues knew, was not somebody who could ever be shown outside black circles. And so, I guess Kennedy couldn't be blamed for thinking of King as sort of a dull and stuffy religious guy. But Robert Kennedy liked the presence. He wanted to meet people who challenged him and confronted him and would teach him things that he hadn't seen. This was the reason why I have this meeting has been discussed a lot, but my book has the fullest discussion of Robert Kennedy's meeting with James Baldwin in 1963, when Robert Kennedy invites Baldwin to meet with him and round up a bunch of people to meet with him in New York at his father's apartment on Central Park South. And Baldwin shows up, and Belafonte is there, and Lena Horne is there, and Lorraine Hansberry is there, and all of these black intellectuals are there. And they really give Kennedy a rough going over. Kennedy is very upset about this. I mean, the thing turns into a Donnybrook. Kennedy expects all of these people to thank him for everything he's doing as Attorney General to assist the civil rights movement, and they all feel that the Kennedys are dragging their feet, and they start dumping on him, and it's a very dramatic scene, and Kennedy is apoplectic afterwards and denigrates all of the people that were invited there and finds disparaging things to say about them, finds homophobic things to say about James Baldwin, says who are these people, and who are they? Half of them are married to whites anyway. I mean, he's very angry about the whole thing afterwards. But it's significant that Robert Kennedy called the meeting to begin with. Robert Kennedy invited all of these guys. He put himself in the line of fire, more than John Kennedy ever did. Robert Kennedy was curious and wanted to learn. These were not the radicals that you were referring to, Bud, but you're talking about meetings, including the night in Indianapolis, the night that he gives the speech, where he wants to meet people off the street. And he wants to meet people who are sort of more plugged into the community, not these highfalutin people in suits and ties, but the street guys and the guys in the African clothes and the guys with the afros. And these are the people that he wants to meet. I mean, there's one story in the book where he's meeting with Bud Schulberg, the American writer and screenwriter, organizes a writer's workshop in Watts after the riots. And Robert Kennedy is invited to speak there. And Robert Kennedy says, "Don't bring me any Uncle Toms. I mean, I want to meet people who really represent the community." And that's the other side of him, and it makes him such an intriguing guy to write about, that he really wanted to learn, and he wanted to be challenged. And I think it's another theme that runs through his life, that he was kind of a macho guy. I mean, the conventional explanation is he was the runt of the litter, and he was the smallest of the Kennedys, and so that's why he played on a broken leg and got his Harvard football letter, which Jack and Joe never got. Always trying to one up his older brothers, this is why he was whitewater rafting and climbing mountains and all of this, and part of that macho thing was taking on unruly people and finding out what they had to say. And that's, as I say, it's one of the reasons that it's fun to write about him, because he's always sort of surprising you and shaking things up and making you realize, his own complexity.
You don't, Martin Luther King, as you mentioned, and is brought out as a theme in the book. David kind of knew he was on borrowed time to some extent in terms of how long he would be around, perhaps. You don't think that Kennedy at one point in the book you kind of talk about how he didn't think that bad luck could happen again,
Well, it's really interesting. One of the other things that you do when you're writing a book like this in a limited time, and where an awful lot of the material has been reviewed already, you have to find eyewitnesses, and you have to ask them questions that they haven't been asked before, or you have to find people who haven't been interviewed before, people beyond the usual suspects. The usual suspects here are, people like Andrew Young, John Lewis, anybody who knew both of these guys or one of these guys, Marion Wright Edelman, Peter Edelman, Belafonte, there are, the universe of them is small. When I was talking to these medical people the other night, I said, we're all in the same business, we're all in the triage business. I have to get to these people before they die. And that's what this was really almost in the nick of time that this was done, and that's true for the Burns book, that you're reading now, Miriam. I mean, it was the last chance to find anybody who knew, we're rescuing history. And one of the people, there was one interview that I had with Harry Benson, the photographer. Harry Benson has had this glorious career as a photographer and photographed the Beatles when their pillow fight. I mean, again, Bud knows more about all these things than I do. He's probably had a program with Harry Benson, right?
It's extremely important to know who photographed the pillow fight in
Yeah,
Paris.
and you do, and you do and you do know that.
This is important too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you do know that. Anyway, Harry Benson, not Harry Belafonte, Harry Benson photographed both King and Kennedy, and he described the difference between their behavior in crowds. And he talked about how Robert Kennedy was sort of heedless of the threats around him, that he just plunged in, and he had sort of, his fatalism was not in, he knew that he was targeted, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. And he was going to plunge in and fate be damned. He was, he resented restrictions on his actions. He told his minimal security people not to resort to sort of evasive tactics, not to unload the car in the garage, to park on the street even though there were crowds outside the car. His security guy, whom I tried to interview, his chief, the guy that was with him the night in Los Angeles, just died the other day. I never could get him to talk to me, but now his oral history will be available to read now that he's no longer around. Bill Barry. Anyway, this is Harry Benson describing Robert Kennedy's kind of. Robert Kennedy was a free man, and he wasn't gonna let fate or danger inhibit him. It's the flip side of, again, the whitewater rafting and climbing Mount Kennedy and all of that. He was not going to be stopped. King had a very different response. Harry Benson was saying that when King was in a crowd, he was looking around everywhere. He was acutely aware of the threat that could be behind from any window or any elevated position he was, and they got him out of there as quickly as possible. I think that if I'm not mistaken, Benson photographed the march from Selma to Montgomery, or one of those epic civil rights events, and he described King's feeling of menace as opposed to Kennedy's feeling of liberation. So they both felt that there was a gun, that there was a bullet with their names on them, but they had fundamentally different responses to it.
Can I ask you, David, sorry, but I know I want you to jump back in, but the Irish are big into funerals, and there's a lot of emphasis put on funeral traditions and stuff in the Irish context. And in that vein, I don't think it made it into the book. I think you wrote about it in some pieces afterwards. Kennedy stepped in with pragmatic support for Martin Luther King's funeral, and can you talk a little bit about that flight with the three widows?
Yeah.
It's really fascinating, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, when King was shot, Kennedy sort of went into action, and Kennedy gave his speech in Indianapolis. He had been advised not to because, as you all know, it was in one of the worst ghettos in Indianapolis. The police chief told him not to go. The mayor of Indianapolis urged him not to go. The mayor, Richard Lugar, later Senator Lugar, had never even been to this part of Indianapolis before. And that was, again, one more reason for Bobby Kennedy to go, and he did. And then he went back to the hotel that night, and he instantly went into action and called up Coretta King to offer his condolences, and then to help plan for the funeral. And he said, these are all things that wouldn't have occurred to her, but he said, you're going to need hotel rooms. We'll help book hotel rooms for you. You're going to need extra phone lines in your house. We'll get on that, and we'll arrange for the phone company to install extra lines in your house, because he knew the trouble he had getting through that night to speak to her. And he said, and then he said, and is there a way that you're going to get the body back from Memphis to Atlanta? If not, we'll get a plane for you. I mean, this is the kind of thing that one would have thought the President of the United States would do. But Robert Kennedy, as I said in the book, Robert Kennedy was in a way that night the de facto President of the United States already. And he was the one, as he said to her, I think he said something like, we Kennedys know something about assassinations and planning for the consequences of assassinations. And Mrs. King was faulted for accepting help from a presidential candidate, and she said, listen, he's been through all this, he can help us, and I wasn't going to turn him down. It's just one of the striking stories about Robert Kennedy going into action and mobilizing and putting, the Kennedys were very organized and going to work and making sure that the funeral would proceed in the way that it had to.
So how did the three? So it's Coretta Scott King, Ethel Kennedy, and Jacqueline.
Well,
Kennedy
this is. I mean, after Robert Kennedy was shot 2 months later in June, Coretta King flies out to Los Angeles to be with Ethel Kennedy. I mean, there were interesting stories. Again, just to backtrack a little bit, and you'll bring me back if I forget where your question. But now I've lost. After Martin Luther King was killed, Bobby Kennedy goes to the funeral in Atlanta, and I mentioned before that I interviewed Andrew Young. Andrew Young has given a lot of interviews over the years. You can imagine. I mean, he must, on any given day, he must have any number of reporters calling him because he knows all the history of this era. I called, but he's somebody who knew these two men, and therefore a very precious person to be able to have the great luxury to talk to. And he described for me. It's what I begin the book with. He described to me leaving the hospital in Memphis where King had been declared dead, and convening a meeting to figure out where the civil rights movement was going to go. I mean, they had to get their act together and decide what to do that night. And where could they meet? Well, there was really no other place to meet but back at the Lorraine Motel. And they went into Martin Luther King's room, and that's where they met. And King's dirty dishes from his last meal were there, his suitcase was there, his clothes were there. They were surrounded by all the personal effects of their martyred leader. And he told this absolutely incredible story, which is not even in his own memoirs. This is another secret, really, to writing something like this, that even people who've been interviewed many times still have things to say that they haven't said before. And I thanked him, and I said, "Well, what a privilege it is to talk to you, and thank you for sharing all of this with me." And he said, "Well, no, thank you." He said, I'm never going to get all these stories out. I couldn't fit them in my memoir, and I'm never going to get them out. And you did me a favor, you've done me a favor by giving me a chance to tell this story. The other John Lewis described the story about the Kennedys escorting Robert and Ethel Kennedy down to see King's coffin that night in the church, just by themselves, just the 3 or 4 of them together. Going down to pay tribute to King as he lay there. this was the kind of bonding experience. The Kennedys were very visible down there, and Coretta King felt bound to them in a way that she hadn't before. And so after Robert Kennedy was shot, Coretta King goes to California to be with Ethel Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy leaves New York to be with Ethel Kennedy, and then they have to bring the body back. And this is the moment that you described, that you mentioned, Miriam. There's this flight back. In this instance, the White House did send a plane, Air Force One. They're one of several Air Force Ones. Jackie Kennedy refused to board the plane until she was assured that it was not the same plane that had taken her back from Dallas. It was a different Air Force One. And you have this incredible moment when the three widows are all on this flight together. I mean, I get goosebumps even sort of thinking about it. And it had never really been described before. It's in my book, but only briefly. And I thought that as one of the stories that I did to sell the book, when the book came out, I did a very long story in the Washington Post about this last flight. The flight manifest is, if you see, this is one of Kennedy's advance men had saved the flight manifest and shared it with me. It's never appeared anywhere before, and it lists Pierre Salinger and all of the people in the entourage. And if you look at it, you'll see Jackie Kennedy is on there, Coretta King is on there, and obviously Ethel Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was sitting with the coffin at the beginning, Bobby's coffin in the front of the plane. And most of the people, going back to the triage point, most of the people who were on that flight are dead. But there were a few who were still around. And I found the one surviving Secret Service man who actually saw the three widows talking to one another briefly. Really, they were, for everything that they shared, there was still a racial line between them, and Ethel Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy were not close, but there was one moment at the beginning of the flight where the three widows are together, but just the idea that these three women were on that flight together, again, it's like the question that Bud asked earlier. I knew that no matter how difficult it was to find particular information, there was a story in that flight. One way or another, there was a story. There were only 3 reporters on the flight. I mean, you can imagine how different it is from today when it would be swarming with people. But there were only 3 reporters on the flight, and they were all friends of the Kennedy family. None of them were working. And there was this sort of unwritten promise that they weren't going to talk about it. They were there as Bobby Kennedy's friends. Bobby Kennedy had many, many, many friends in the reporting corps, including Pete Hamill, and again, crossing lines in a way that would never happen now, helping to write speeches for him and stuff like that, sort of shocking stuff. But anyway, I knew that there was a story in that flight, and the Post, gave me this incredible space, and I think it's just a very dramatic thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the pleasure through the years of interviewing more than a few people who were in Bobby Kennedy's orbit in 1967 and 68. Some who were actually in the room in 68. Rafer Johnson, Rosie Greer, that famous audio we all go to, get the gun, Rafer, get the gun. And talking to the 2 of them, and then others like Pete Hamill, like Jack Newfield, who followed him in 67 and 68 in the campaign. And through the years, my experience has been talking to them, it's like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
And there was something about it that was just different, both in the positive, perhaps in the transformation of the man, and also being in the room. This is going back, say, 20 years, talking to Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer. When I brought it up, they talked about it, they teared up, and it was as if the assassination had happened yesterday. Presuming that perhaps you had a similar experience with some people that you talked to, what do you think that's about?
Well, I envy you for talking to Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer. I mean, I didn't really talk to, I never did reach Rafer Johnson. I should have thought of calling you,
That's
you
right.
know?
Did you talk to Bill Barry?
Well, I just mentioned Bill Barry. Bill Barry who just died the other day.
No, I was at his funeral.
Oh, were you? Well, I would have called you. You know, I would have called you for access to him. Bill Barry was was the security man, the former FBI guy who followed Bobby Kennedy everywhere, and he decided at a certain point to stop talking to reporters. He'd had enough, I guess, and I moved heaven and earth to try to talk to him. It was very hard to find his family because they used to be in Rockland County, but I don't know what happened to them. And he had oral histories. I mean, I mentioned before about the Kennedy families being very assiduous about recording their own history. He gave a very long oral history to the Kennedy Library, and he gave another oral history to Jean Stein, the mother of Katrina vanden Heuvel, who did a book on, I was going to say this before, there's a book about Robert Kennedy's final train ride from St. Patrick's, down to Washington to Arlington for the funeral, but never anything about that flight. Anyway, I needed.
Did you not write the article about Palm Beach when you went to the door and Bill Barry took everybody away?
No, that was
It was
no.
in the New York
That
Times, right?
yeah, I didn't write
I didn't
that.
see the byline it was.
No, I didn't write that, but I needed the family's permission to get to either of these oral histories where he presumably described his experiences with Robert Kennedy, and I could never get anybody. They never got back to me. Very frustrating.
And also recently the busboy died.
And the
As
busboy died too. I didn't. I mean, for those of you who end up reading this book, I don't. There are various things. I don't know whether Robert Kennedy had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. I figured I was not going to break any news about that, so I didn't go down that hole. I don't know whether Sirhan acted alone or not. So I didn't get in. These are just black holes that a reporter can go down and from which one never emerges. And I figured that I would have nothing distinctive or original to say about that. And so, I mean, I did find in court papers, I did find, the garbage man that Sirhan got friendly with in Pasadena, the guy that picked up the garbage at the Sirhan house, who was talking politics with Sirhan 2 months before the assassination and asked Sirhan, who are you going to vote for? Or Sirhan asked him who he was going to vote for, and he said, I'm going to vote for Kennedy. And Sirhan supposedly said to him, you're not going to get the chance because I'm going to kill him. I mean, that was, I hadn't seen that story before. That was, again, something that was buried somewhere. But I didn't go into the assassination, the conspiracy theories and stuff like that.
That's not the crux of the book. That's not what the book is about.
Yeah, that's right. But
what I did find interesting, though, which I had never, perhaps it was known, but I had never dawned on me that the assassination happens on the 1-year anniversary of the 6-Day War.
No, right, and that part of the story has kind of been forgotten. That Sirhan, was upset over the sale of jets to Israel and all of that. Just to answer your other question, though, but it interests me how reporters conduct themselves. Interests me. I just had an op-ed article in the Times that some of you may have seen about Little Rock and about the reporters who surrounded the black girl, Elizabeth Eckford, in the Little Rock Nine and kind of protected her against the mob after she'd walked the gauntlet in front of Little Rock Central High School. And it raises interesting questions about what reporters should and shouldn't do when they're covering a story and when they cross a line. And this is something that you see a lot in the Bobby Kennedy story, that reporters really fell in love with him. It's really striking. I mean, my own feeling, I was 16 when all of this stuff was happening, and I remember I didn't much like Robert Kennedy. I didn't like him because I thought that he was a pale imitation of his older brother, whom I loved, and whose death shakes me up to this day. And I mean, sort of loved in kind of a juvenile sort of way. And I didn't like the way that he was sort of wrapping himself in President Kennedy, always talking about President Kennedy. Well, as President Kennedy used to say, I found something macabre and sort of exploitative about it. I didn't like it. But the reporters who covered him lost almost all objectivity, and they're really they fell in love with him, and they were devastated when he was killed. There's a story about Richard Harwood, the reporter from the Washington Post, whose son John Harwood you might see on television from time to time. He's a reporter on CNBC, a very good reporter. And his father, Richard Harwood, was a tough old Marine, and gave Kennedy a very hard time early when he was assigned to cover him, felt that Kennedy was making demagogic statements. And over the course of the campaign, he became very close to Kennedy, felt himself getting close to Kennedy, and within the last couple of days of the campaign had resolved to take himself off the campaign because he was falling in love with Robert Kennedy. He felt he was losing his objectivity and had to get himself off the story. I don't, that's just unimaginable now with anybody. I mean, in this day and age, that is just, it's unfathomable that could have happened.
Well, what's unimaginable is that he would pull himself off the story. It would be it's a different world, granted, apples and oranges, but imagine if, Sean Hannity went on, seriously, and said, I am too close to the president, I will give up my television show. That would be shocking. Anyway, shall we take some questions?
Yeah, can I, just while we have the opportunity, would you mind just talking a little bit about Dreadful, your book Dreadful, David, just to...
Well, just first of all, it's a dangerous thing to title a book Dreadful. You're handing a reviewer, a nasty reviewer, a lead paragraph.
Note to self.
This is a biography of an Irish-American gay novelist from the World War II era and shortly afterward. I had the opposite problem of this book, of The Promise and the Dream, because in this instance, it's actually a wonderful problem to have. I was writing about a man who'd been utterly forgotten. But I hadn't forgotten him because he wrote a novel about my prep school that was still banned from the school library when I went there. And he had died 15 years before I got to my school, but his book was still talked about in hushed terms because it's a roman à clef where various people who were still teaching at the school were readily identifiable, and it scandalized the school, and the librarian made sure that there were no copies of it around. But somebody had told me the story about this guy, and I was always curious about him, and I set out to write about him. He was somebody who wrote one of the most important novels at the time about World War II, one that got an enormous amount of attention, was reviewed in all the right places. He was on the cover of the Saturday Review of Literature. He was Gore Vidal's great rival as a gay writer about World War II. He wrote this daring novel about Naples during the American occupation, and was just this wonderfully complicated, angry, bitter, bitchy, alcoholic guy who wrote wonderful letters that had been saved and were sitting in the bottom of the box at Boston University that his family had just sort of shoveled up and donated to the school. And it's a story about this brilliant man's rise and fall. And as I say, I felt in this instance as if I was just rescuing the last people who had had him for classes, and he'd been greatly influential in the classes that he'd had, were dying off. And he himself had gone back to Italy after he tried to settle back in America after the war, and was like many GIs, never really could get his feet back on the ground, and moved back to Italy after the war and basically drank himself to death. And had come from Andover, Massachusetts, had gone to Phillips Academy in Andover, and been cum laude graduate of Harvard. I mean, it's a slice of Irish American culture. After graduating from Harvard, just to tell one story about him, he wanted to come back and teach at Andover. He was really a brilliant guy. He was fluent in German, Italian, and French. And Andover wouldn't hire him because he was an Irish Catholic. And he wrote a letter to the headmaster, and the headmaster said, you know, of course we can't hire you, and places like Hotchkiss and Choate, Exeter, they won't hire you either. Why don't you apply for a position in the Boston school system? You know, they take mix like you. I mean, that wasn't the phrase that he used, but that was the point. You know, there they'll take you. This absolutely brilliant guy, and much to my school's credit, my prep school, they hired him. And for that, you know, he thanked them by writing a vicious novel about the place, and it's still banned from this. I guess it's in the school library now. John Horne Burns. John Horne Burns, his famous novel, I mean, the one that got an enormous amount of attention at the time in the mid-40s, was a book called The Gallery, which is a novel about describing various people around. For those of you who know Naples, the Galleria Umberto, the arcade in the middle of Naples. And it's sort of like, it's a book that all these people are, there are stories about all these different people who are in the gallery at one time or another. The gallery is the spine that kind of runs through all of these individual stories.
It's interesting, that was your penultimate book before
Yes,
The Promise and the Dream. It's
yeah.
interesting to hear how the different topics present different challenges in terms of this distilling down and coming up with something new based on people well written about, and then
Yeah.
kind of starting from scratch.
Yeah, that's
with
right.
Someone else.
And you know, I mean, I'm not well versed enough in Irish American history. I mean, I see the incredible stuff that you do here. I mean, it came up on your website, you know, a book or a thesis on Irish and black intermarriage in New York City in the 1870s. What a great topic. Who would think about something like that? And yet, you know, you think about the race riots during the Civil War, but intermarriage between these two outgroups in 1870, but there's enough of it to write about it. And for all the differences between these two projects, at Hollywood Cemetery outside of Boston, Rose and Joe Kennedy are buried in one of the elite plots there, and you can go, and I think other Kennedys, you know, other infant Kennedys, and I think some of Ted Kennedy's family are buried. The Kennedy family plot is there, and just up the hill, you know, in the more plebeian section, that's where John Horne Burns is buried.
Oh, wow.
So the two books come together in the Irish-American connection, the Irish-American adventure is embodied in that cemetery. I mean, the Burnses were, you know, the Burnses went to Harvard. Burns's father, you know, got into Harvard at a time when there weren't a lot of Irishmen getting into Harvard, you know, and Burns got to go to Harvard because he was so damn smart that they couldn't keep him out, you know. And then they all end up within a few feet of one another in the cemetery outside of Boston.
Do we have any questions, folks? Yes. Your mic there.
King, I was struck by your quote there about King and making that statement in January 1957, because he was almost killed in Harlem in 1958. Can you guess whether, when they got to know each other a little more, that Bobby Kennedy ever knew that about King?
Oh, I'm sure that he would have known. That was that was extensively covered. There was this sort of deranged woman. King was signing books at a store in Harlem, and she stabbed him with a letter opener, and almost killed him. And in fact, King, the night in the speech in Memphis, the night before he was killed, he tells that story again, where he says, you know, if I had sneezed, it all would have been over, because the letter opener was lodged next to his aorta, you know, within, you know, a hair's breadth of his aorta, and would have killed him. I'm sure that the Kennedys would have. It was widely covered, so I'm sure that the Kennedys would have known about it. Whether he ever made that connection, as I say, I think that the Kennedys cared about the Kennedys, and I don't think that I don't think that he would have made that connection. I just think he wouldn't have made that connection.
And fast forwarding to '67, Andrew Young was on one of the documentaries, and he talked about nobody wanted him to go to Memphis. Nobody. And they weren't thrilled about Chicago either.
Right.
Do you have any sense that Kennedy, I mean, maybe you've answered already saying that the Kennedys were always thinking about it. You see, what's so great about what you're doing is that it's 50 years ago now. I mean, so much has happened.
Yeah.
And so much hasn't changed, but it's so important that what you're doing, so you're raising all these kinds of questions. You think Kennedy had a sense that things weren't really going very well for King's movement in those last months?
Oh, I think so. I think that it was there for everybody to see that King had become a very vulnerable figure, and King was getting it from all directions. And you know, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC was attacking him from one direction, and establishment black leaders were attacking him from the other. I mean, they were, people like Carl Rowan were writing, you know, what are you thinking? How can you, Lyndon Johnson is our best friend. How can you oppose him on the war in Vietnam? We're trying to show our patriotism. You know, our boys are over there in disproportionate numbers, and you're undermining them by taking on the Vietnam War. Stay within, what's the term now? Stay within your lane. I mean, they were all, so he was getting it, you know, Kennedy might not have known how depressed King was, or how King was despairing for his future and the future of the movement as he saw it, and the future of nonviolence. But I think Kennedy recognized that King was damaged goods, and had to be, when Kennedy started to run for president, King's support was important, but not to be flaunted, because it would cause problems for him. You know, every once in a while, when you're in my position and there aren't a lot of people to talk to, you sort of have to take guesses about interpreting certain things. Kennedy gives this speech in Indianapolis extolling King the night that he was killed, and the campaign is suspended after that for a few days, but he gives one more speech in Cleveland the next day, decrying violence and what's going on in the country. And he doesn't mention Martin Luther King in the speech. And how can you talk about violence the night after the leading civil rights leader is murdered and not mention Martin Luther King in the speech? And my theory is that already Kennedy, there was that one aberrational moment in Indianapolis when he's speaking about King, and then he starts backing off by the next day. And he doesn't mention King for the rest of the campaign, really. And I don't think that was any accident, for the same reason as I say that it's very hard to find a picture of the two of them together.
Thank you for a great discussion. As I was listening, I found myself wondering about one contemporary figure who might provide a connection between your protagonists, and that's Cesar Chavez. And of course, he knew Kennedy reasonably well, and he was inspired, at least by his version of Martin Luther King in terms of nonviolence and under-strike strategies. I was just curious if he comes into the book at all, or if in your research you found any connections along those.
You know, that's a great question, and I don't. That might have been a very productive thing to pursue, but I didn't. I don't know what Chavez's connection to King was. You know.
Yeah, and I don't know if
I don't know if there. It never popped up.
Yeah.
You know, it never popped up. The evolution of that was a very important part in the evolution of Kennedy. You know, that and his trip to the Mississippi Delta the year before, all part of the kind of sensitization of Robert Kennedy that that happened after his brother's assassination, and that's when people talk about Robert Kennedy evolving, that's usually the explanation, that's the jolt that did it. But even before then, and I said before that Robert Kennedy had no sort of macro sympathy for the civil rights movement prior to 1960, but there are stories. He invited Ralph Bunche to speak at the University of Virginia Law School, where he was running the Speakers Bureau when he was a student at the University Law School. And the University of Virginia was a Jim Crow institution. I mean, it was segregated. And there was a local, I think it was a local ordinance, or it might have just been a tradition, that there could be no mixed audiences in Charlottesville. And yet Ralph Bunche, when he came to speak at the school, insisted that he was not going to speak to a segregated audience. He wasn't going to speak to a racially separated audience. And Robert Kennedy sort of agitated and went all the way up to the university president, and got the rule waived for the night that Bunche spoke. And so he spoke to an integrated audience that night. Now, I suppose that when you're Joe Kennedy's son, you can throw your weight around a little bit, but it shows that he had a certain instinct for unfairness, and that was even before, long before his brother was murdered, and that was an instance of it. Now, part of the literature is that Ralph Bunche couldn't. There was no place for Bunche to sleep that night in Charlottesville, in segregated Charlottesville. And Ethel and Bobby Kennedy put him up in their home that night, and the story is told that all kinds of things were thrown at the house, and there protests and stuff. And what my research seems to show is that Ralph Bunche went back to Washington that night. He didn't stay in the Kennedy house. Mm-hmm. It's just a myth. And so part of our job, I mean, these guys don't need to be elevated through myth. I mean, what they did was heroic enough, and they're more believable the more real they are. And so part of our job is to go through the literature and filter out these myths, which I tried to do. I would have happily, as I said, asked Ethel Kennedy that question, but I could never speak to her.
A few years ago, I had the great fortune and privilege of doing a profile of Harry Belafonte, and in discussion he told me that, and he was very close to Dr. King, told me that he would notice that King had a tic, like a facial tic, and then he noticed one day that it stopped. And he asked him, I see that tic stopped, what happened? And he basically said, I've made my peace with dying. Mm-hmm. You've talked a lot today about, and understandably, about Bobby Kennedy. Is there something in particular in the research that you found out about King, or something around him, that really caught you by surprise?
I'm going to have to think about this, but you raise an interesting question, Bud, and I think it's something that I need to be honest about. This is about King and Kennedy, but it's more about Kennedy than it is about King. Yeah. This program today is, I tend to gravitate in that direction. The research gravitated in that direction in part because there's so much more material on Kennedy, because the King papers are still sort of unorganized or unavailable or closed off to researchers. There's more of a Kennedy research establishment. The Kennedy Library is, a huge operation. The Kennedy family is more open than the King family. The King family is sort of famously monetized, very like the I Have a Dream speech and stuff. I tried to speak to one of King's children. People had told me that only one of them was even remotely available, and I should try her, and I did, and I never got anywhere. My answer would be incomplete if I stopped there. I mean, I think in a way, and this is something that it's been a theme in my work in a way, that I gravitated more towards the white part of this history than the black part of this history. Maybe it was a certain kind of comfort level, I don't know. I mean, I tried to, so I think there's a slight imbalance, and there's a slight imbalance even in my consciousness in speaking about it. So I should have a ready answer for you about that.
I think that answer illustrates a lot.
Well, that's an honest answer.
Right. And you also made the great point earlier that in 50s and 60s, perhaps different now, maybe not, America, Bobby Kennedy had the freedom as a white man to be more of a three-dimensional character.
Yeah, and
Martin Luther King, who is leading a revolution and always has to be on the lookout, be it for bullets or anything else, doesn't have the freedom, the leeway to be a three-dimensional character,
right,
and go on the Tonight Show and be funny.
Right.
He's leading a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And one device that I'm sort of pleased that I thought of actually was, I tried to imagine what Martin Luther King would have said if he had to give a speech the night that Bobby Kennedy was killed. As opposed to the speech that Bobby Kennedy had to didn't have to give, but gave the night that King was killed. And, I speculated that it would not have been a great speech, and it wouldn't have been nearly as great a speech because he didn't have the freedom to say what he was thinking, and he would have had to be on his best behavior, and he would have had to be very serious and solemn and play it by the book because he didn't have the freedom that Robert Kennedy had to go into the ghetto in Indianapolis and say whatever came to his mind. And I think that's right. He had to be, his behavior always had to be beyond reproach. I think that I stuck a little bit closer to the existing literature on King than I did on Kennedy. Although, I had arguably better interviews, like with Andrew Young and Belafonte. Those were better interviews than any interviews I had with respect to Kennedy, and also that I interviewed Clarence Jones, who was Martin Luther King's lawyer, and a very interesting guy and somebody who's insufficiently appreciated. An interesting conversation with him where this hasn't come up today, but the whole issue of why Bobby Kennedy would have approved wiretaps on Martin Luther King, and there's sort of a Kennedy apologist industry out there.
Didn't Bobby work for Cohen?
Yeah. Well, he worked with Cohen.
There's a connection.
Well, he worked with, yeah.
Communism.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it was Hoover. It was Hoover more than that. But there people, including Arthur Schlesinger, I think, said that Bobby was, later felt very guilty about approving the wiretaps and really did it as a favor to Martin Luther King. Through what kind of convoluted process would it have been a favor to Martin Luther King? Well, because Hoover was coming after King because of his alleged communist associations, and in fact, one of King's most important advisors had been active on behalf of the Communist Party. There's no denying that. He had left the Communist Party and wasn't particularly involved with them by the time the Kennedys came along. But that, the theory was that if Kennedy got to listen in on all of King's stuff, he could attest to the fact that King was not doing anything communist related and therefore had a clean bill of health and could say it, and he was really doing it to sort of clear Martin Luther King of any communist taint. And that's the revisionist thought. And if you have Martin Luther King's lawyer still alive, you give him a call, okay, and you say, there's this theory out there that Kennedy was really doing Martin Luther King a favor by tapping his phone. And you have King's lawyers say, bullshit,
Right.
and then you have your answer.
Right.
That's the great luxury that you have when you still have eyewitnesses around.
But under the laughter through the tears heading, Clarence Jones would also talk about, like, they knew they were being tapped. So
Yeah,
like,
right.
okay, everybody.
Yeah, right.
We all set? Everybody listening in?
Yeah, right.
Listen, folks, thank you so much, David and Bud, for a really great conversation there, and congratulations again,
Yeah.
David, on I think it's a really the how you write it we know what's going to happen, we know the climax of the book, it works so well in that you know what's going to happen, but the way it's written carries you through in terms of, you know, that climax that works so well. I couldn't put it down when I started reading it, and commend it to everyone to pick up and have a browse through. This image behind, I just want to mention, is actually Coretta Scott King at the coffin of Bobby Kennedy in St. Patrick's Cathedral. One of our alumni, who's the archivist for the Archdiocese of New York, gave us a loan of that image. And actually, David, do you know, on this memorial card or programme that was printed in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the remarks from Kennedy's, an excerpt of the remarks that he made, you know, in Indianapolis, who do you think would have decided upon that?
No, I think Ethel would have decided that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they in fact, they were trying to track down the source of the Aeschylus quote. Even on the plane, they were discussing how to find it, and Jackie thought that she might have it in a book, and they were going to look for it, but I'm sure that this all went by Ethel. Yeah. I mean, it's a bizarre kind of thing, the way the Kennedy family mobilized. They'd been through this before, and they mobilized. The whole Kennedy apparatus went into overdrive to organize the funeral and the funeral train and everything, St. Patrick's service, everything.
Can you imagine any politician, no matter your political persuasion, being on the stump today and quoting Aeschylus?
Well, you know, can you imagine, I went to the memorial service for Robert Kennedy on the 50th anniversary at Arlington Cemetery. I think there were 4,000 people there. I mean, can you imagine any historic figure attracting something like that 50 years later? And I can't even imagine John Kennedy. You know, I mean, Robert Kennedy really has superseded John in the public imagination, which is really quite an extraordinary thing. And I think that in a way, just to maybe wrap this up, we didn't really explore and I'm not an authority on how Robert Kennedy's Irishness influenced his story in a way, and his Irish-American background. We talked about it a little bit. It's not something that I feel comfortable expounding on at great length. But I do think that, in a way, Robert Kennedy is kind of the more elemental and transparent Kennedy, more than John is. And you can sort of understand John better by studying the more raw, open, accessible rendition that you get with Robert. John Kennedy was a very highly polished kind of performer, and you have the more visceral Kennedy in Robert, and a lot of the things that John Kennedy managed to paper over are there for all to see with Robert, and therefore it's fruitful to study him. And before you say anything else, Miriam, I want to thank you for inviting me here, and having sort of the sense that a different kind of angle to talk about, and I'm grateful to you, and of course I'm grateful to Bud for coming and participating and asking his usual fine questions.
Thank you, and please, there's a little reception downstairs, folks, and the book is available. Please continue the conversation. You're more than welcome. Thank you.
First of all, he's just a much more volunteer.
Yeah.
Second of all,
I forgot to warn you about the
Right, yeah.
and it's also reminding what's going on out there.
Gentlemen, can I introduce you to Professor Kevin Kelly? He's the
Hi,
director of
Hi,
Glucksman.
Kevin. How are you?
Thanks for being here.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
It's an interesting link for
Yeah,
future.
I have a feeling that
Thanks for
you don't have to run out.
Yeah, right, but it's just the ideology.